All right, so in this section, we're going to talk about one of the first main theories of personality, which is specifically the psychodynamic perspective. So if we jump into this here, we can see that we have mainly four big psychologists that played a role in this perspective. One primarily being Sigmund Freud. And so he was sort of the pioneer of this perspective and of this psychodynamic approach. And then we're going to actually talk about three other neo-Freudian psychologist or new Freud-like psychologist that took this approach as well, but built off of the work of Freud. But so some main assumptions or some main sort of points of how this perspective approaches personality is generally that when we look at personality and we try to understand sort of where it comes from and what it means, we say that personality is due to these internal processes or conflicts within ourselves. And so we're going to see how a lot of this has to do with sort of these underlying or unconscious conflicts that we might see at different stages of our life, but that these conflicts within ourselves are what sort of produce these personality traits. Also, that we aren't really aware of what factors produce our personality. So while we might have these internal conflicts, a big portion of this perspective is that a lot of it is unconscious. So we're not aware of these components and how this actually translates into our personality, but instead it's all sort of operating under the surface of our awareness. And then the third one being that we can't change and we really can't control our personality. So this isn't something that we are consciously or able to decide on or choose our personality, but instead, at least this theory argues that our personality is really outside of our control. So let's first start by talking about Freud and his main theory and his main approach, or the psychoanalytic perspective of personality. And so Freud really kind of believed a lot in the unconscious and put a lot of emphasis in what was happening under the surface and below our awareness and how this played a role in personality and developing that. And so he actually kind of created or proposed these three different components of the mind. That being that the mind has a conscious mind, or the part that we're aware of, that we can control and that we have feelings of in the moment. But then it also has what's called the preconscious mind, which is kind of this intermediary bit where it kind of connects between the conscious and the unconscious. And then, of course, that third level of the unconscious mind, which is out of our control, out of our awareness, but also the seed or the root of a lot of our sort of conflicts and things that might create these different personality traits within ourselves. And so we kind of have these three different components of the mind, and the preconscious mind helps kind of connect those two other ones of the conscious and the unconscious. And we'll see a lot of his theories talk about ways that we sort of might access the unconscious mind through the preconscious mind in ways of looking at things like dream analysis or free association tasks. But generally speaking, Freud's main theories and ideas were about how do we understand the unconscious mind in order to better understand what our conscious or our personality traits are sort of coming from. Freud also had sort of three different structural components of the mind here as well, and how he organized the concepts of the mind. And so these three were the id, the ego, and the superego. And so the id is really sort of this core personality, this core sort of like, infantile piece of our personality that is really guided by the pleasure principle. And so this really states that it is really kind of like this child inside of us that just wants to seek pleasure and will do whatever it needs to receive pleasure. And so it's really sort of this selfish desire and this sort of unrefined aspect of ourselves. Then we have the ego, and this is really sort of that middle layer, more of our conscious, more of our, mid ground of ourselves. And this sort of develops out of the id and starts to learn, okay, maybe some of these impulses we need to sort of suppress, and we need to be able to kind of control, for delayed gratification and things like that. So this is guided by what's called the reality principle, which is really kind of saying that, performing actions and doing things to guide our reality and what is truly going to help us in the long term and in delayed gratification is more through this ego standpoint, or this ego part of the mind. And then lastly, we have the superego, and this is really kind of focusing on higher order or higher sense of right and wrong, things like morality, things like ethics, and ways that we can kind of make decisions and form ourselves in ways that don't just act on ourselves, but act in the greater sense of what is right and wrong. And so when we look at each of these things, we can kind of talk about the ego as sort of this core piece where it kind of acts in between and also acts as sort of the main component of ourselves and how we can more realistically, or using the reality principle, achieve sort of proper fulfillment and proper personality traits that help us exist in the real world and operate on a day-to-day basis. And so when we look at these, we can see what we do a lot of the time, or use, or at least Freud's theories were that we use these defense mechanisms, right? And these mechanisms are things that help us to try to challenge or overcome some of these threats to our anxiety. And so we can see some of these, and some of these might sound familiar, and you might even recognize yourself doing them or other people you know doing them at times. But things like repression, where we sort of repress down negative threats to our anxiety and we try to just ignore them, or denial, where we sort of just argue that they don't exist. We might project our own feelings onto someone else or onto something else. Maybe we have some type of regression or rationalization as to why we did something for some reason, even though maybe that wasn't the right thing to do at the time. And so each of these kind of acts in a different way to, again, try to deal with some of these threats, both conscious and unconscious threats to our anxiety and ourself, to try and resolve that anxiety and be more comfortable with our actions and behaviors and the choices that we've made. Now, Freud also had what we'll call sort of an interesting approach to, or theory of, how we develop our personality throughout our life cycle. And his theory really kind of broke down into these 5 different psychosexual stages. And this was really kind of a big core piece of how Freud looked at things and how he looked at psychology and individuals. And he looked at kind of these 5 stages as conflicts that either got resolved or developed into sort of specific personality traits throughout someone's life. And so we can see early on sort of what's called the oral stage. This is the idea of willingness to delay gratification. And we can think about this as sort of early infants, right? Learning to not always cry and demand food when they are hungry or needing some type of subsistence. And so this really is this idea that either someone learns to delay this gratification or they don't. And if they don't, they can have sort of these personality traits kind of going forward. And then we have the anal stage, and this is really learning to seek pleasure only in certain situations. So it's the idea sort of learning to be toilet trained, right? That you learn that there are appropriate places to seek that sort of physical sensation versus other less appropriate places. Then we have the phallic stage, and this one's kind of named interestingly, but generally the idea is, so it says, go along to get along with the powerful. And really what this means is that we sort of learn to, listen to people who are above us in power, typically our parents or caregivers at the time. And we learn that by abiding by those behaviors and acting in those ways, we get things that are good for us or that we want to have. And so it's this idea of going along, listening to sort of authority figures, and then having some outcome that is positive to us from doing so. Then we have the latency period, and this is really sort of where we branch out beyond just our immediate family, and we learn that there are other people, other resources that sort of can be beneficial to us in the world, so that we might rely on friends or other people outside of just that immediate core group to, again, deal with maybe difficult times in our lives. And then the last stage being the genital stage, being this idea that we learn to give pleasure to get pleasure. And that is not just in a sexual way, but also in, a way that could be just general empathy or empathetic components of interacting with other people, where helping someone else can also feel good and help us as well. Again, Freud kind of broke down this development of personality into these 5 stages, and based on how you resolve these conflicts at these stages, his theory was that sort of formed your personality long term. So let's quickly kind of break down and talk about sort of the pros and cons, or the strengths and limitations of Freud's approach here specifically. And so I think Freud was a really interesting psychologist, very influential psychologist, but a lot of his theories we've sort of built upon, or at least moved past a little bit. And so I think it's important to highlight some strengths and limitations here. So first off, some strengths that we have is that, well, he was one of the first people to start kind of like looking at the mind and saying, maybe we need to kind of talk about this and look at what might be going on either unconsciously or to some level that we can't just observe outwardly. And so this was an important step, an important kind of progress in this field. He also kind of looked at, again, these defense mechanisms and how we kind of maybe do things to try to defend that anxiety of who we are and make that okay within ourselves. And so this is something that we see support with still, and those theories do sort of hold up even still today. And then again, of course, Freud is a very influential psychologist. We see even people outside of the field typically recognize the name of Sigmund Freud. And so he brought the field of psychology into a much more popular range and allowed us to sort of build the field in a lot of different ways. Again, of course, a lot of limitations here. So Freud had generally a very negative view of people. And I think generally a lot of these conflicts and a lot of these personality components, unconscious desires, unconscious sort of conflicts, all were negative in nature. And so I think that framed a lot of his theories and how he kind of structured things from a little bit more of a negative perspective. And we'll see how that changes with some of these future psychologists. Also, he often looked at patients that had serious psychological disorders. And I think this is why some of that framing took place, because a lot of the people he was working with just were suffering from more severe situations. And so, of course, he developed his theories around sort of those situations and around those types of people, and maybe applied that potentially too broadly to others. And then again, we have some, the last limitation I'll point out here is just this idea that his defense mechanisms, right, while they are supported and while we see evidence for those still, he thought they were at this sort of unconscious level where we weren't aware of them, but we can see that we are aware of some of these things that we do. And now more recent research has shown that these are things that we are a little bit more aware of and have come to light a little bit more. All right, we're now going to talk about 3 neo-Freudian psychologists. And really this just means new Freudian psychologists. And so these are people who sort of studied under Freud and took his ideas and advanced them just a little bit, but still took the general perspectives and framing that came from that psychoanalytic perspective of Freud. And so the first one here is Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, generally his addition or his sort of new way of looking at things was that he proposed that people as a whole share sort of this collective unconscious, and that as a society, as a species, we have sort of developed what are called archetypes or archetypes of personality. And so we can see some examples here throughout history, throughout literature, and they kind of appear in different ways. So we have things like the sage representing this personality archetype of wisdom, right? We can think of examples like, the wise old man or the wise wizard in different stories. But this archetype, this type of personality appears over time. And this is sort of due to this shared collective of ideas and types of personality traits. Same thing about things like the child, some innocence, right? That this is a personality type that children sort of take on. Maybe there's the trickster or the class clown, and that these are personality, again, archetypes that we all sort of share and understand collectively. And so we might be biased sort of in fitting into one of these archetypes, whether that's how we see ourselves or how we see others, but that this might be how we look at personality is through this lens of these different shared archetypes that we view the world through. And so this was really Jung's addition or his sort of approach or perspective adding on to this theory. The next one is Alfred Adler, and his main kind of addition here is very simply just that he took the approach that it's not really these psychosexual desires that drive our personality like Freud argued, but instead it's really this desire for superiority, right? And so children will naturally feel inferior to their parents or to adults, and so our drives, our goals and personality is to become more superior throughout our lives and strive for this superiority. Again, this is just sort of his addition, his approach, his theory that he added on to sort of this Freudian perspective. And the last neo-Freudian psychologist we'll talk about is Karen Orney, and her really approach here was interesting and looked more not at personality from an individual perspective, but more from an interpersonal perspective. And that a lot of our personality traits and focuses come from how we interact with other people. And so she kind of had these three different criteria or three different components that can affect and sort of, change our personality in different ways. So she had sort of this strategy of moving towards people, which is really the idea that we might behave in certain ways to obtain affection and benefits from being around and with other people. So we might do things that, again, are going to basically have positive social outcomes in order to sort of have these benefits of being around other people. And so this could affect our personality in this way. Then we have moving against people. And this is a way that we might seek ways to overpower or get ourselves into a more superior position against other people. So we might have aggressive personality traits or behaviors in order to obtain power over others. And people might develop personality traits due to this reason as well. Then we have moving away from people. And this might be that we develop personality traits that have us sort of regress away from society or withdraw from other people as sort of a group. And we might have personality traits that are due more to wanting to be removed and have more individual components. And so she really looked at personality and how we develop personality more from this social or interpersonal perspective as opposed to the individuals as much themselves. So again, a unique perspective, still building off of Freud's theories, still a neo-Freudian psychologist, but took this more interpersonal approach to looking at personality.